Welcome. As with my last few videos, the focus of this month on my channel is learning Black history, both the highs and the lows. So far we've talked about a couple of really amazing people and a couple of terrible events, none of which was ever taught in school, at least in my schools. There was Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Race Massacre, the inventor Frederick Jones, the Move bombing in Philadelphia, and the award-winning author, poet, activist, composer, etc., Maya Angelou. Today we talk about another tragic event that I didn't learn about until taking a psychology class in college. And the discussion was always the importance of ethics and informed consent, neither of which were present for this experiment. We'll be talking about the Tuskegee Experiment, or the Tuskegee Syphilis study. Not only were there short-term effects immediately following, but the long-term psychological effects on the community as a whole can still be seen today. I say event, but I do want you to keep in mind that this took place over a very extended period of time. 40 years, in fact. So, in 1928, a study was conducted entitled the Oslo Study of Untreated Syphilis, and the subjects of this study were several hundred white men. A few years later, in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service wanted to now study the progression and effects of untreated syphilis in black men, as they believed the effects of the disease differed dependent on race. This study, with the intention of only lasting 6 months, began in Macon County, Alabama. Signs went up all over with the promise of free medical care for participating in the study. A total of 600 impoverished black sharecroppers signed up for the study. After all, with the promise for free medical care for bad blood, which was a term covering a host of ailments, along with free meals and free burial insurance, how could they say no? Even today, these things are worth so much here in America, but not your life. These men went into the study expecting treatment, but that's not what happened. Of the 600 men who were enrolled, 399 already had syphilis, and 201 acted as the control group. At first, they would actually treat some of those with syphilis, but with treatments like arsenic, bismuth, and mercury, or a combination of these. These were highly toxic and only marginally effective. Not long after the study started, they began giving everyone ineffective medicine, whether that was a placebo pill or something like aspirin. So a 0% chance of treating their syphilis at all, although the participants were never aware of this. The lengths the researchers would go to in order to keep these men from getting treatment so they could watch them die was horrendous. So not only were they telling the men they were treating them, and they weren't, but they would go so far as to hand out a list of participants to local doctors to make sure that they didn't treat them either. Eventually, by 1940, 8 years into a 6-month study, they started giving these lists to the Alabama Health Department as well, so that they could also turn the patients away from treatment. When World War II came along in 1941, 256 of the men involved in this study were drafted, and this untreated syphilis came out in their medical exams. Instead of letting the men be treated, the researchers had them removed from the army so that they could continue the study. The original basis of the study was that black people, regardless of economic status, would not seek treatment. But as you can see, at this point, they are not only lying to them about treatment, but they're actively preventing them from getting treatment elsewhere. Things get even more disgusting in 1947 when penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis. They had been studying the effects of non-treatment for 15 years, but that wasn't enough. They still didn't provide penicillin to the participants, even though they still believed they were receiving treatment and not just being left to die. Questions about the ethical integrity of the study weren't first raised until 1955, when an associate professor of the Medical College of Virginia, Count Gibson, expressed his concerns. These concerns were of course ignored, but were once again raised in 1965 by a doctor who had read the study in a medical journal. You guessed it, these concerns were also ignored. 1 year later, a Public Health Service venereal disease investigator named Peter Buxton also expressed his concerns about the ethics of the study. A committee was formed to further investigate. Can you guess what happened? It was decided that the study should be continued until completion, or in other words, until all of the participants had died. Peter was like, nah, this ain't right. And he ended up leaking the story to one of his reporter friends. This reporter friend then passed on the story to Jean Heller, who was a reporter with the Associated Press. She broke the story in the New York Times on July 26, 1972, with the headline, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years." I've linked that below in case you want to read the article that finally ended this atrocity. With this now being a front page story, the CDC and Public Health Service had no choice but to again review the study. The panel involved in the review this time found that while the men were told they would be receiving medical care, they weren't even informed of the study's actual purpose and didn't receive treatment as they were told they would. It was finally shut down after 40 long years. By this time, of the original 600 black men, 28 had died from syphilis and 100 died from related complications. Not only that, but 40 of their wives were also infected and 19 of their children were subsequently born with the disease. With the fallout of the study came changes in research requirements. Informed consent had been around quite a while, but finally became law in the U.S. with the National Research Act. You may be wondering, what is informed consent and why is it important? Let me tell you. I'll start by saying I have a psychology degree, and gaining informed consent is so vital that it was drilled into us in every single class and was drilled in further every time we discussed any kind of research. In a nutshell, informed consent is the permission given by participants prior to taking part in a study. The informed part is what's especially important here because unlike with the Tuskegee study where they were not given the facts and they were lied to, participants are told the truth. Informed consent includes providing them with the purpose of the research and how long it will last, potential risks or adverse effects, or any possible benefits. It also must make them aware of the incentives for participating or consequences for not participating. They also must be given contact information should they have any questions. With all of this information, they can then make the informed decision of whether to participate in the study or not. The Tuskegee Experiment is just one example in American history where black people were lied to, misled, injured, and even died for the benefit of their white counterparts. For their 40 years of deception, with the advisory panel having declared this study unethically justified and ended it immediately in 1972, a $10 million settlement was reached to the benefit of the participants and their families. While this settlement was rightfully done and helped ease the burden in the short term for those directly involved, the long-term effects continue to harm the community at large to this day. The mistrust in the medical community that stemmed from this highly unethical study is still a side effect of what was done. According to one study published in 2017, life expectancy at age 45 for black men fell by up to 1.5 years in response to the disclosure of the actual purpose of the study in 1972, accounting for approximately 35% of the 1980 life expectancy gap between black and white men and 25% of the gap between black men and black women. Many other studies, of which I've listed a few below, show a significantly higher level of distrust among the African American community versus the white community, regardless of economic status. Not only are they generally less likely to participate in research studies, but less likely to receive medical care in general, whether it be a visit to the doctor or getting a vaccine. This is especially important to talk about in our current climate, given we are living in a pandemic where minority communities are more at risk. I live in Tennessee, and here alone, the Tennessee Justice Center published a report in July noting that black Tennesseans account for only 17% of the state's population, but 20% of the COVID-19 cases and 36% of COVID-19 deaths in the state. Many across the country are skeptical about the vaccine, but especially those in the black community who remember what was being done not that long ago in Tuskegee. Understandably so. Well, that is all I have for you today. I hope you learned not only about the Tuskegee Experiment, but also about the deeply rooted effects it had that still cause disparities in medical care today. I'll see you next time.